Hello. In this lecture, I'd like to provide a demonstration of how you can access the Contacts content provider, a system content provider, a built-in provider. We're going to read the contacts from our phone, and we're going to display the contacts that have an address. So we're going to need to use the Contacts content provider for reading. We're also going to update, add new records to the Contacts content provider by writing. So we're going to create a new Android Studio project. And we're going to name this Android Studio project Contacts Example. So let's close the existing project that comes up. It's the last one loaded. And say New Project, Contacts Example. We're going to leave everything as default. We're going to create an empty activity and say Finish. All right, so now we have a main activity. It's empty. We know the deal. I'm going to change this to project. Let's look at our layout file, and we see that we have an activity main. The first thing we want to do is we want to create our user interface files. This application is going to be similar to our database application in terms of the user interface. We're going to have a list view. It's going to display the contacts that have addresses, and then there's going to be a menu option, a plus, to insert a new contact into the Contacts content provider. So inside our main, we're just going to put in our list view, and we're going to use a relative layout. And we're also going to need to create some string variables. So this is just going to contain a simple list view item. Pretty easy. So let's also add our string values before we get too ahead of ourselves. In our strings, we're going to have resources for everything, for all the insert fields, and then also the buttons and the empty list text. And let's change the app name to have a space. So now if we go back to our activity main, we don't have any problems. We also want to create our text fields or edit text views in our list view. So we're going to need to create a new layout file that contains our text views that goes into our list view. So we're going to say layout, new layout resource file. We're going to name this activity view record. We'll keep it as linear layout, and then we're going to change it to be a relative layout with two text views. So pretty straightforward. Just a couple text views. This is what goes into our list view. We're also going to need to add a screen to add our activity, add our contact, And this is going to contain a number of edit text with two buttons at the bottom. So we need to create another new layout resource file. And this one's going to be called Activity Add Contact. And what this one is going to look like is pretty basic. It's going to have first name, last name, street, city, state, zip code. This is how we're going to insert our contact. We're going to have an OK button and then a cancel if we don't want to insert it. We have to have new handler methods or event handlers for our activity add contact. We need to create a new activity class for our add. We already have our main activity. So now let's go to our Java file. We'll say new activity. We'll say empty activity. We're not going to create a layout file because I just created it. And we're going to name it add contact activity and just say Finish. So now in our add contact activity, in our XML, we can add our on button clicks. Say create an on click event handler. We're going to put it in add contact event. And then we're also going to create one for the cancel button. Okay, so now we have our event handlers and we have our user interface is good. We also have to add our menu because the menu is going to have the plus button where we can add a new contact. So we have to create a new resource file for menu. We can say new Android resource directory. And we're going to name this main.xml. Actually, we're going to say new. You can do this in one step. I keep making this mistake. New Android resource file, and then create the directory on the fly. So main.xml. We're going to put this in our menu. And we're going to add to our menu a little plus button. So we're going to add an item that has add contact with a little icon for plus. So now we can start implementing our main activity. In our main activity, we want to make sure we load our activity main, which we're doing. And then we want to start implementing everything to load all of our contacts that have an address. We're not going to load every contact, just the contacts that have an address. So we're going to need to create some member variables. A lot of this code is going to look familiar because it's similar to other applications. We're going to use a simple cursor adapter. We're going to use a list view. We're going to use a loader. All those things. So let's create member variables for these things. Our list view and our simple cursor adapter. Import the version 4. We also need our loader ID, and we need from and to fields to map our contacts data in our list view. So we're going to create a loader ID of 1976. We're going to have a string array for from, which is our contacts contract.context display name, and then our structured name display name from that represents the address. So these are the two columns in the contacts contract contacts class. So remember, contacts contract is how we can access column names. The contacts content provider has many different tables. We need to access the contacts table in the common data kinds table. The common data kinds has a subtable called structured name. For each of those, the first one is the display name of the contact. The second one is the structured name, which is the address. In our int2 array, we want to map both of those to our text fields, our name and address. And so that's in our view record where we have our two text fields. We then want to set up our list view in our onCreate. We have to get the resource ID. We have to set it to an empty view, and then we're going to set our simple cursor adapter. In our simple cursor adapter is initially going to be set to null because we have to do the query on the contact provider first. So we're going to set our adapter. We don't want to do the query in the onCreate because that could take a long time and make the UI unresponsive. We want to do the query in the loader and then set the simple cursor in the loader by accessing our contacts content provider. So now we also want to add our menu options. So in order to add a menu to our application, we have to override two methods, the onCreate options menu and the onOptions item selected, so that when we select something in the menu, we go to the correct page. So onCreate options menu, we're just going to add the menu from our XML. OnOptions item selected, if we select the add record icon, we're going to go to the add contact activity class. Pretty basic. We now have to implement our callbacks for our loader. So the first thing we need to do is we need to implement our loader callbacks in our class definition. So up here, we're going to go to implements, our loader callbacks. And we're going to import our support for version class. Now we have to implement our overridden methods. The overridden methods we have to implement for a loader are the onCreate loader, the onLoad finished, and the onLoader reset. Our onCreate loader is going to access the content provider. So this is the important information here where we need to set up what we want to search in our contacts content provider. And like I said, what we want to find in the contacts content provider is all of the contacts that have an address. So we need to set up our selection and our selection args for this content provider. So we're going to create two variables. A string selection. The selection identifies the where clause, what we want to say where. We're going to say where the MIME type is equal to something. Selection args are what it's equal to. So we want to say where the MIME type is equal to the structured postal content item type. And what this is saying is where a contact has an address. So selection is the where clause, selection args are the variables in the where. And so we're just saying where the MIME type has an address, where the contact has an address. We then can return our new cursor loader. The cursor loader wants to access the content provider. So we're going to say new cursor loader, contacts contract.data.content URI. This is the table we want to access for our contacts contract. It's the data table. We want to access the columns for ID and display name. So we're going to say new string. This is our table names, ID and display name, column names. We also want to get the name for our column. So 3 things: our display name and our structured name display name, which is our address. That's our first thing. These are, again, the columns that we want to access. We want to pass in the selection, because we only want to select contacts that have an address. Selection args. And then the last argument is we want to sort. And we want to sort by the display name in ascending order. So here, we want to sort in ascending order. And we want to return this new cursor object. So this is how we're accessing our contacts content provider. We are setting in the content UI for our data table. We're saying that out of the data table, we want the ID, the display name, and the structured name, which is the address. We're saying we only want the contacts that have a selection of selection args where the contact has an address. And then we want to sort by the display name in ascending. We also have to implement the onLoader finished and onLoader reset methods. So here, you can do something like that. We just swap the cursors. And now we're almost done. The main thing that we're forgetting is the permissions. In order to read the contacts, you have to request permissions at runtime. So we have to add to our manifest file the permission definitions. And then at runtime, we're going to have to ask for them. So inside of our manifest file, we have to request 2 permissions, or really 1 permission. We can just request to read and write contacts. If we do write, it's also going to read. So right after the package definition, we want to say, we want to access the permission for reading and writing contacts. Now, inside of our main activity, we want to request those permissions. You should also notice that in our main activity, we've never created a cursor loader yet. We've never initialized our loader. Usually in your onCreate, you initialize your loader. We don't want to do that because we want to do that after we get permissions. You only want to read the contacts if we have permissions. And so inside our request, when we request the permissions inside our callback, we'll initialize the loader. So we're going to create a method here that's called request permissions, where we're going to request to read the contacts at runtime. Or really, we're just going to write the contacts, because if we can write, we can read. So we're creating a method called request permissions. We're going to call it in the onCreate. Our request permissions is going to be familiar. It's just going to ask the user for permission to write the contacts. So we'll add this helper method at the bottom. We're going to say request permissions, and we're going to use this contacts compact class. We're going to check to see if we have write contacts permission. If we don't have write contacts permission, then we're going to ask for it. And when we ask for permission, we have to define a member variable that identifies the permission we're asking for, so that the callback, we know in the callback which permission was granted. So let's add a static final int, request permission write contacts. And so now when we request it, we can pass that in so we know in our callback. So if we don't have permission, we're going to ask for it. If we already have permission, we want to reload the data. So this is where we're going to call our getLoader manager, passing in our loader ID, and then restart initializing the loader. So once we get permission, we want to initialize the loader. Get supported loader manager, initialize loader with the loader ID. Right? We have permission. We now want to initialize the loader. We also have to add in our onRequest permission result. Since this gets called when we are first granted permission, we also want to call the init loader. So onRequest permission result, this is an overridden method. If we were granted permission request to write the contacts, then we want to initialize the loader with the loader ID. Otherwise, we just want to say a toast message saying you need to get permission. So pretty nice here. So now we can build this and we can see if we're able to read contacts. Now, my emulator probably doesn't have any contacts loaded, so we might have to add some through the contacts app. If we had the insert working, we would be able to add them through our app, but we don't have that working yet. We're just trying to read our contacts from our contact provider. So here, we're going to start our application, and it's going to be empty because I don't think I have any contacts with addresses in our application. So the first thing it says is do we want to allow the contacts example to access your contacts? It's asking permission. I'm going to say yes, allow, and it's going to say no contacts found. So if I go to the contacts application, bring up my phone, and phone calls might not work, that's okay. But if I go to my contacts and I say add a contact, let's try adding an account. So I went ahead and added my Gmail account. And so I'm going to save all of this to my Gmail account. I'm going to create a new contact. Let's say Jason Fedden. And I'm going to add in address information or else it's not going to show. So let's add in an address. Let's put this down so I can find the address. There it is. So here I'm just going to say 32 Main Street, Rochester, New York 14617. And I'm going to save that contact. So I was able to save this contact in my contacts. And now I want to bring up my application and see if I'm reading from it. So I can go back to my contacts example. And you'll see that Jason Fedden is in there with an address. So it looks like the query is working. I'm able to read contacts from my contact provider and only the contacts that have addresses. So now let's get the insert working. So now I have to implement my add activity, add contact activity. I have my OK button and cancel button events. First thing I want to do is I want to create member variables for my edit text, because I'm going to need to use these in my onCreate and in my OK button selected. So I have edit text for all the data that you can enter in for a contact. In my onCreate, I want to load the activity add contact XML file. So I want to say super onCreate and bundle on saved instance state. And I deleted the bracket. So there we go. Also, I want to initialize my edit text in here so that they're pointing to the right resource. So I want to do a bunch of find view by IDs. Our boilerplate code. I do this a lot. If the OK button was clicked, I want to get my display names from my edit text fields and convert them to strings. So I'm going to create a bunch of local variables that call the edit text, get the text into the string, because this is what I want to insert into my contact provider. First thing I want to do is I want to do some validation. Make sure that the user entered in a first or last name, because if they didn't, I don't want to insert that contact into the contact provider. Otherwise, if they did, we can start creating some content values. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make sure that we add the contact to the right account. So we're going to create two local variables that represent an account type and account name. We then need to create the contact itself. To create a contact, we have to create a content values object. We have to put into the content values object something into the raw contacts table, an account type and an account name. And if we set those to null, we'll be able to add to the right contact with the right account. We can then get the content resolver and call insert just so we can insert our right account, our correct account. And then we can say get the contact ID back from the insert. We know that the insert method in a contact provider must return an ID. So the first thing we did is we just created the account. We now need to also create the display name and all the other days. So we want to clear our content value so we can use the same instance here. And we want to add the first and last names to the new contact. So here, we're going to start putting data into our content values object, our name. We first have to specify the contact ID, which was what was returned from our account creation in the previous step. We also have to specify the MIME type, which you can get just from the structured name.content item type. We then have to specify the first and last names. We can specify the first and last names by accessing the common data kinds structured name table with the given name column and the family name column. And then we can call our get content resolver and insert on the data table. We can put those values in the data table. So we're adding our first and last names in this step, using the correct tables in the content provider with the correct columns to the correct account. We've added the first and last name. Now we need to add the address information. The address information is located in a different table. So we have to once again put in different tables and column names to our content values. So here we have to access the data mom type for the structured postal. And we have to set that to our content item type there. We also have to access the common data kinds of the structured postal table and access the street, region, postcode, type, and city columns and put our data in those right columns. So here we're populating all the address information into the correct table of the context content provider. That's what we're doing. The last thing we need to do is we need to insert it. So we can call insert right there, and then we can just say finish, which will close the activity and go back to the main activity. So just to reiterate, all we did was we filled content values, key value pairs, with the correct column name and the correct data. We used all the data from our edit text fields. We did some validation because you don't want to insert a contact that's empty. We created an account first, and we put in a null counts. We inserted that. We got back the contact ID that we can now use to put in our first and last name using the right table, structured name table. And then we can also put all our address information in the structured poster table with the correct columns. And you'll notice for the type, I just set the type of the address to type home because you can have like a home address, work address, and so forth. Then lastly, I called the insert method. And for the close on cancel button clicked, we can just say finish. And that's it. We can now test to see if our insert, if we're able to add contacts to our contacts content provider. So let's build this, run it on the emulator. And when the emulator comes up, we only have one contact in the contacts app, Jason Fed. If we hit the plus button, we should be able to add another one. So here let's add Joe Smith. We'll say 35 Main Street. Say city is going to be equal to, I don't know, Sacramento, California. And then we're going to say zip code. I'm not sure the zip code. I'll just make one up. And we're going to say OK. When we say OK, we see that Joe Smith is there. But let's actually check to make sure it's in the contacts app, because the contacts app is also reading the contacts data content provider. So if we go to the contacts app, we see Joe Smith was added to the contacts contact provider. So it's in our app. If we select that, we'll see it has 35 Main Street, Sacramento, California, 13333. And it's our home address. We could change that to insert somewhere else. That's it. So this was an example of how we can access a built-in content provider, our contacts content provider. We just have to specify the correct content URI that identifies our tables. We use the the content values object, and we use the put methods on that. And we just make sure we put in the right columns of the right table. We access the columns in the table from the contract classes, contacts contract. And then we just call insert on it. And for our query, we just populate our cursor loader. So thank you.